The Fed just had their first meeting, and this has a domino effect on everything from housing prices to credit cards to savings accounts to auto loans. So it's important that we cover this topic so you can understand how it affects you, so you can make the best decisions to make money.
Today, the FOMC raised our policy interest rate by 25 basis points.
The Fed Chairman Jerome Powell announced a 25 basis point rate hike that takes the effective funds rate from 4.5 to 4.75%. The looming question here is how they're interpreting the economic outlook of the US economy. Are they going to continue to increase rates, keep them stable, or do they have intentions of actually lowering the rates? Before we dive into that though, let's get a brief primer to better understand how the Fed works and the levers that it uses to control the US economy. The Fed was established in 1913. It's a separate entity from the US government. It can make its own decisions without legislation, without the presidential approval. And it was mainly designed to help protect the consumer credit, the banking regulations, and it was designed to avoid banking panics, to protect consumers, their credit, the value and the banking balance sheets responsibility amongst financial institutions within the US government. Two big priorities of the Fed are to keep inflation under control, ideally around a 2% annualized rate, and to keep unemployment low, between 3 and 4.5%. And the Fed really has three main mechanisms that they can do this from. They can do this by adjusting the effective federal funds rate. That is the interest rate hike we just experienced, going from 4.5 to 4.75%. They can print money, and when they print money, they literally create a reserve on the balance sheet. And the third thing they're doing is called quantitative easing. And in a nutshell, essentially they'll buy back bonds, securities. It's another way of printing money where they're buying securities and bonds from the actual market. That money is getting injected into the actual economy. So in March of 2020, when all heck broke loose, the Fed used their mechanisms to light a fire under the US economy. What they did was they kept interest rates extremely low. They actually pressed them down to near zero, and they printed a ton of money and started buying assets at a record pace. In fact, they printed over 5 trillion US dollars, and they bought over 5 trillion securities and bonds and assets. And this had major ramifications for the US economy because the US economy's GDP is around 23 trillion, but yet the Fed had literally just injected another 10 trillion into our economy. So you can imagine a 50% increase in the money supply in the economy and what that could do to stimulate things. As a result, we have seen some of the highest inflation in nearly 40 years, peaking around 8 to 9% back in June of 2022. This inflation is not good. It is destroying the savings accounts of Americans and the world. Imagine you had a bank account with $100,000 and you're saving up to buy a home. We also saw during that same period of time with the cash injection and low interest rates, home values actually shot up, averaging in some cases, in some markets, over 20% year over year increases in appreciation. At the same time, we were seeing inflation devalue the dollar. So imagine someone having $100,000 in their savings account, it's going down in value, and the value of the assets they want to buy are going up in cost. Well, it doesn't make any sense. Economically, it's not sustainable. As a result, we've seen a lot of affordability go down. So taking it back to the beginning of the video, this is the first meeting of the year where the Fed decides the funds rate. And going forward, it's going to affect the ability of the average consumer, their discretionary spending, their purchasing power, and the value of the savings that the investors have, as well as their portfolio. They've now taken rates to a historic jump from near zero value to almost 4.75 basis points. And they're really on a mission to effectively lower and crush inflation. And ultimately, that'll be a good thing. The question really comes down to if they're going to use these levers in a way that doesn't overstop the economy and pump the brakes way too hard where we go into a recession, or increased Fed funds rate results in higher borrowing costs, which ultimately affects everything from auto loans to credit card percentages to consumer spending to housing prices and mortgage costs. It affects everything. So as these rates go up, they stay stable, or they decide to go down, investors, economists, financial people, individuals like you and I, we're looking for indicators to see if the Fed is still going to maintain an aggressive stance, or if they're seeing enough signs in the economy that inflation is coming down and that things are getting under control. If they don't, then ultimately they have those levers at their disposal. And we are understanding now through this video what those levers can impact in terms of inflation and our ability to purchase and afford things. In 2022, as an example, when the rate hikes started, companies like Microsoft, Apple, Meta, Google lost over $4.5 trillion in market cap value. Several of those companies actually went down by over $700 billion in value. And across the entire market, the Dow Jones, the NASDAQ, the S&P 500, we saw declines anywhere from 17 to 30%. So there has been a lot of pain just in the early 6 to 7, 8 months of them raising rates, but also the level of aggressiveness that the rates have gone up. The Federal Reserve's rate hike isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just something to be wary of and to better understand how it affects the mechanisms that they're going to use to control the money supply and the actual amount of capital that's available in the market.